As I mentioned before, this section concerns digital artwork foundations, some basic concepts that can be hard to find in simple, easy to understand terms. Where this all starts out with is what kinds of artwork can be made in the digital world. As you know, in the real world, art comes in many forms: sculpture, painting, you name it, fiber arts. You can make artwork in so many different ways, but in the computer, inside the computer that is, there's really only two types of artwork. And those two types are called vector and raster. And that's the two ways that a computer can see artwork inside the computer. So based on that, let's talk about vector first. So what I'm doing here is I'm actually displaying a vector image. And a couple crucial things I'm going to point out while we're looking at this slide. This is an image of a bicycle, but as you can see, it's been drawn. This bicycle has been drawn. It's been drawn in vector format. What's cool about this is about vector artwork. You'll notice that if we zoom in on the fork here, on this little chevron triangle, we zoom in 3 times and you can see it still looks nice and clean. And if we continue to zoom in 24 times, zoom in on that just that little area, you can still see how the edges remain clean. That's one of the great things about vector artwork, is that it's always maintains clean edge no matter how much you enlarge it. Let me go into a little bit more detail on vector. So vector graphics are made up of lines and curves, and these lines and curves are called vectors. As I mentioned, these are drawn. So in other words, you create vector artwork in drawing programs, Illustrator, CorelDRAW. But interestingly enough, Word and PowerPoint are also vector drawing programs. So we'll definitely talk more about this. A really key thing here is that vector graphics are resolution independent. The term resolution does not actually apply to vector graphics at all. So if anybody ever comes up to you and says, I have a vector image, what resolution should I make it? The answer is vector images don't have resolution, so I can't answer that question. But we'll definitely talk more about this. I'll explain what I'm talking about here. Text in lines and vector images are usually very easy to edit. As long as you've got the right tools. Text in particular is very easy to edit. You put your cursor in place, and if you want to change something, you delete the characters you want and you replace them. So that's one of the great things about vectors. It's very easy to edit. Now, fonts are vector objects, and I'll just one point we always like to make is that fonts in figures should be embedded in the figure or converted to outlines or paths, and I'll show you what I mean by that. Also, lines created with vector, you want to keep them at least a quarter of a point thick. Thicker is always fine, but you go down below a quarter of a point and you start getting a little too thin. Alright, now one thing I want to talk about is vector images. I want to point out that there's really only one place where vector images, vector objects exist, and that's inside the brain of the computer. You, as a human being, will never, technically, you'll never see a vector object, because everywhere else, whether you're talking about a printer or a monitor, when you're looking at a vector object on a monitor, or you send a vector image to a plate set or wherever it goes, it's always converted to pixels. And that's the other type of artwork called raster. So let's look at a raster image. Here's the same bicycle, but in this case it's a raster bicycle, and you can see some differences pretty quickly. I'll go back to our vector one in just a second just to compare the two of them. But something you can see immediately, this is not drawn. It's actually a picture of a bicycle. And what's very interesting is if you zoom in on that same area that we zoomed in before 3 times, it still looks pretty clean. But if you zoom in really tight down to 24 times, all of a sudden we no longer have lines. What we see here is pixels. And these pixels are square objects with two basic properties: size and color. Each pixel in there saves that information. What size is that pixel and what color is that pixel. Now, a key thing to think about with raster images is quality is determined by these pixels. And to make it really simple, this is really the only thing you need to know. Pixels are meant to not be seen. Anytime you can see pixels, you've got a quality problem. Pixels are supposed to be very, very small. And what happens is when they're really small, we view them, and our eyes and our brains aren't really capable of seeing individual pixels when they're really small. We see them along with everything else, and it appears to make nice smooth shapes and stuff. So anytime you can actually see the pixels, you've got a quality issue. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump back to this vector. So what this is an actual, it's drawn from that raster picture. So somebody took the time to go into Illustrator and redraw. They started with this picture and they redrew it as vector. So they completely had to redo it. So there's some very key things to think about here. The big advantage is this quality thing. Of course, when you look at the vector one, it's not the same thing, and there's no way you can make a vector object look exactly like this. Well, I shouldn't say no way. There's some people who try very hard to make vector objects look like raster objects, but it takes a lot of work, let me tell you. Okay, so let me go into a little bit more detail on raster images. Raster images are made up of pixels, which by the way is short for picture elements. Now, unlike vector images which are drawn, raster images are created by capture devices, digital cameras, scanners, microscopes. There's other stuff out there, I'm sure, but those are the three that come up to my mind first of all. And you process them in image editing programs such as Photoshop. You know, Photoshop is kind of the industry standard, but there are certainly other applications you can use to process raster images. Very key thing, raster images are resolution dependent. In other words, the resolution of the image has everything to do with how big you can print the image, what the quality is, that kind of thing. They're resolution dependent, unlike vector images, which are resolution independent. For this reason, text and lines in raster images, they become pixels and are very difficult to edit because instead of being nice little objects that you can grab and work with, you have to work with pixels. Now, they can be edited, but it takes time and a lot of effort. It's not easy to edit raster images. We will definitely talk more about this. Okay, my next slide is something, don't worry, I'm not going to read this to you and you don't need to read it right now. I'm going to go ahead and show it here. It's on the printouts, and if anybody in the future is seeing this, just pause your screen for a second and read this if you want. Basically, it's a little discussion of PPI versus DPI, and it's important to bring this up just because PPI stands for pixels per inch. DPI stands for dots per inch. Technically, whenever we're talking about an image on your computer, we should be using the term PPI because it's pixels, not dots. When you're talking DPI, DPI is really for the printer. Printers print dots. So the dots in a printer are the DPI. That being said, I'm kind of bad about this. A lot of people use the term DPI to mean PPI, and I very well might do this during this presentation, so don't let it throw you off. I should say PPI, but I'm sorry. Yeah, but sometimes I say DPI. And here's the slide actually talking about DPI. So again, pause your screen if you'd like to read this part. Moving right along. Okay, let's talk about what resolution is all about. Resolution is the number of pixels per inch in a particular image. And side by side here, we'll take a look at these two images. And as you can see, this 72 ppi image and this 300 ppi image, the 300 ppi is a better quality image at this size, because you see how you can actually read this text here. When we zoom in on the little triangle, it looks good. Everything looks good. Whereas the 72 ppi is kind of fuzzy. You can actually see some of the pixels, especially in curves. And if you zoom in on that triangle, you can totally see the pixels. So again, when you can see the pixels, you've got a quality problem. I will point out, however, even in the 72 ppi, you can see what it is. So it's not necessarily, 72 ppi is not necessarily bad, it's just a matter of what you want to do with it. In this case, it definitely, you can see a major difference. We'll keep talking about this. A key term when talking about resolution is you need to think about effective resolution, because resolution is dependent on the size of the image. Resolution and size are actually kind of the same thing. And to show you what I'm talking about, say we wanted to print a figure at 50 picas wide, and that would be 8 1/3 inches. And that image was 160 pixels per inch at that size. Well, that's kind of low, and as you can see, it's a little bit fuzzy. The quality's not great. A way to fix that very easily is to reduce the image. If you reduce the image to, in this case, less than half the size, 21.6 picas, in essence, the resolution more than doubles. Anytime you half the size, you double the resolution. That's effective resolution. So it's effective resolution is the actual resolution factored for scaling. In other words, how big you're making it. You reduce this, you're going to get more resolution. If I tried to enlarge this, there'd be less resolution. So the larger it gets, the less resolution you have, and therefore the more likely you're going to see pixels. But this image at 8 inches, which is kind of fuzzy, at 21 picas is actually looks pretty good. So effective resolution is what really matters. It doesn't matter what the original resolution is, because that's dependent on the size. What matters is what resolution is going to be at the final size that it will be printed. Let's talk a little bit more about resampling and resolution. And what I've done here is I've shown you two image size dialog boxes, and I'm going to break out and talk about this in just a second. Okay, what I'm showing you here is the image dialog box in Photoshop. And what I'm showing is the number of pixels in the image and the size. So this particular image is 900 pixels wide by 868 pixels tall, and it's 36 picas wide by 34 picas tall at 150. Now if I wanted to play with the size of this, there's a little box here that says resample image. If I change the size, I'm going to resample the pixels. But if you uncheck that box, I'm going to show you something interesting. Notice how over here my pixel dimensions I'm able to change these, whereas over here they're locked in. I have no ability to edit these. Resampling an image is all about changing the actual pixels. And let me actually break out from the presentation and go to Illustrator to show you a couple things. First, I'm going to actually show you what vector images are all about. So I'm going to make myself a new file, and I'll just make it 5 inches wide by 5 inches tall. And I'm going to put an S right in the middle of this, and let's make it a pretty big S. Let's make it a 60-point S. That's very large. Though it doesn't really matter. I could have done small just as easily. Now, this S right now is a vector object. And if we what's great about vector objects is if we zoom in on this S, no matter how much we zoom in on it, that curve is going to be very clean, very sharp. And I'm actually zoomed in at 6,400%. So it gives you an idea of what vector images are all about. No matter how large you make them, they look good. Now, I mentioned earlier about converting type to outlines. Right now, this being a font, what is happening is that the computer itself, if I wanted to print this S, the computer itself would actually look to the font file, because every font is actually a file that exists on your computer, and that file contains the vector shape for this object. But if I do this neat little thing called Create Outlines, and it's under the Type menu in Illustrator, and do Type, and then Create Outlines, what it does is it takes the vector shape from the font file and applies it to this object so that now it is no longer an S at all. It's just a shape that looks like an S. And then now I can show you what a vector is all about. If I zoom in really tight now and I select it, you notice that there's a little point right here and there's a point right here. So the way the computer understands vector objects, let me zoom in a little more to really show this. The vector object means there's a point here, and then there's a mathematical equation that describes the curve between these 2 points. In this case, you've got a point here and a point here, and there's a straight line between the 2 points. So the computer sees, okay, draw a straight line between these 2 points. Draw a curved line with this equation here, and then draw a curved line here between these 2 points. So it's all based on mathematical formulas to maintain the shapes. Okay, so that's a vector object. But what's kind of cool here is I can turn this vector object into a raster object. So I'm going to save this file. I'm just going to save it on my desktop as, I'll just call it S vector. And then I'll close it. And then what I'm going to do next is I'm going to open that in Photoshop. And in Photoshop I can say File, Open, go to my desktop, and I'll choose that S vector. Now Photoshop is a raster editing program. So what Photoshop is going to want to do, and it actually gives me this little import PDF dialog box is what it's called, but that's really the same thing as saying I'm going to rasterize this. And it's asking me what size I want to rasterize this. And say I wanted to rasterize it so that I could print it pretty large. In that case I might want to make it 600 ppi. And it's also going to ask me for a color mode, and it's going to choose my default color mode, and that's fine for me right now. So when I say OK, what Photoshop is doing is converting that vector S to a raster S. Now let me just kind of put these side by side. I'm actually going to flatten this so that I have a white background. Now that S looks perfectly good. It doesn't look any different from the vector S, does it? Let me bring that vector S back up. So there's my vector S. Here's my raster S. Now don't let the background throw you off, that gray background versus the white background. There's a slight size difference, but they're the same thing. But what's interesting is if I start to zoom in on my raster S, and I better save this as a raster S before I forget. I'm going to save this as S raster, and I'm actually going to save it as a TIFF. When I start to zoom in on this raster S, voila, there are my pixels. They are no longer nice, sharp lines. I can now see rectangular, or rather square, pixels. So that's what I mean by resolution being dependent. There's nothing wrong with raster images. They can look totally clean and totally high quality as long as you keep them to a decent size. And the size you can print it at is going to depend on the resolution. So in this case it looks great at this size, but you go up more and then you start to see your pixels, and that's not as good. Okay, let me actually open up a different image to talk about our dialog box. I'm going to open up this picture I took actually a couple years ago when I was at Snowbird in Utah. In fact, the first time I ever did this presentation, I took this picture that morning. I thought it was a very beautiful morning. So let's talk about the image size dialog box. If I go in Photoshop, I go from image to image size. I can get an idea of how big this picture is and how big I can print it. Now what's interesting, I took this picture on my Nikon D100, so it's 2,000 pixels wide by 3,008 pixels tall. And if you're interested in these kind of things, people always seem to be interested in this. If I bring up my calculator and I take 2,000 pixels in width and I multiply it by 3,008 pixels in height, I get 6,016,000 pixels. So this image has 6,016,000 pixels in it total. Well, guess what? 6 million pixels, that's 6 megapixels. So this particular camera is a 6 megapixel camera. Now that may not sound like a lot, but back in 2003 when I bought this camera, that was a lot of pixels. So, but it still takes a great picture. I love this camera. But it doesn't have as much resolution as, nowadays you buy cameras that are 12, 14 megapixels quite easily. So they'd have a lot more. But if you're ever curious what the resolution of what 6 megapixels mean, that's what it means. It means take the width, the pixels you can make in width, multiply by the height, and you get the number of megapixels in millions. Okay, so this happens to be 6 megapixels, 2,000 by 3,008. But you know what? It's only 72 dpi. So you may have heard, 72 dpi, that's low quality. Well, 72 dpi by itself is not necessarily low quality because it's 28 inches tall by 42 inches high. That's actually quite a bit of resolution. So you could actually print this thing quite large. Now, we were talking about resampling. This is a very key thing. Right now, I can easily change the size of this. Say I really didn't want it to be 27 inches tall by 42 inches tall. I only need to print this thing 4 by 6. So if I go in here to my width and I change it to 4, there we go. I got a 4 by 6 image now. Problem is, because I'm choosing resample, I'm now downsampling this to 72 dpi. And guess what? When I do that, now I've got a small image, and if I zoom in on it, I can see my pixels. So now I've created a pretty low-res image. So I'm going to undo that, bring myself back to my high-res image, and go back to the image size dialog box. If I want to make this thing 4 by 6 inches, and I want to keep my resolution, I need to uncheck this little box that says resample image. And as soon as I do that, my width is locked in. I can no longer change the amount of pixels in here. And watch what happens if I make it now 4 inches tall. Now 4 by 6, it's 500 pixels per inch, which is actually very high quality for printing. So as a general rule, even though it's the default in Photoshop to have resample image checked, you kind of want to uncheck it so that you're not throwing pixels away when you don't want to. And vice versa, I'm going to reset this to my original. Say I wanted this to be higher resolution. I said, if I came in here and said 600, say I wanted this to be 600 dpi because I wanted it to be 600 for whatever reason, and I typed in 600, I'm adding tons of pixels. Now, instead of 2,000 pixels by 3,000 pixels, I'm up to 16,000 pixels by 25,000 pixels, which is just ridiculous. The file size is over a gigabyte, which is huge. So I don't want to do that. So I'm going to reset it again. If I knew I wanted it to be 600 dpi and turn off resample image, I'll know when I type in the 600, I'll know that it can be 3 by 5 at 600. So this image size dialog box is all about the pixels, and I can talk more about this later if you want to discuss, but right here this tells you all you need to know really about resolution. Very, very important image dialog box in Photoshop. Okay, let's go back to our presentation. And I was I just mentioned that resampling image is best to avoid until you really know what you're doing. Just when you go into the image size dialog box, turn off resample image. So I'll point it out in other terms. When you create pixels where there were none before, that means upsampling, and another term for it is interpolation. Now, I showed you on our mountain picture what interpolation does. It adds lots of pixels, and it's not always a good thing. It is usually best not to interpolate, and unfortunately, I think this is something that happens very often. You might have an author who sends you an image that's got low resolution. You say, well, I'd like a higher quality figure. And they say, well, how do I give you a higher quality figure? And you say, well, I need more resolution. Well, they can easily open it up in Photoshop, leave resample image on, and type in more pixels. And boom, they've got more pixels. That's interpolating. But unfortunately, that doesn't actually improve the image really at all, as far as I'm concerned. There are some cases where it's worth doing. But as a general rule, just adding pixels where there weren't any before, in other words, interpolating, is not a good idea. It does not improve the quality. And the downside of interpolation is if someone has done that, most pre-flight systems are really just looking at pixels. They're not looking at quality. They're looking at number of pixels. And their pre-flight applications are looking to see if something's high quality by the resolution. Well, if somebody has interpolated an image, the quality may be very bad, but there's enough pixels. So it will pass pre-flight without a second glance, and you won't actually see the problem. So definitely a good idea to avoid interpolation. And the way to avoid interpolation is to uncheck that resample image box when changing size. Okay, the opposite of downsampling is opposite of upsampling interpolation is downsampling. And that's discarding unneeded pixels. Like say you've got an image, you've taken a picture with your 14 megapixel camera and you just don't need that many pixels. You can downsample it, sure, not a problem, but do it only if you know you won't need those pixels later. Like for instance, you've taken an image and you really like it and you know that you're going to print it in the journal and it's only going to be 3 inches wide and you know you only need it to be 300 ppi at 3 inches wide. So you throw away all those images. Well, turns out that somebody says, hey, that image would look great on the cover, and the cover is 8.5 inches wide by really tall. So, and you've now downsampled your image, and you can't bring them back. So, only downsample when you know you won't need the pixels later, or vice versa. Keep the original full res file. When you downsample, save it with a different name. Save it as a different name. Use that one, and then you'll still have your original full res to go back to if you need it to be larger for something else. Okay, moving on to types of images, and I'll go through this fairly quickly because I think you're fairly familiar with this. We basically deal with 3 types of images: line art, halftones, and combinations, or combos. And I will point out that all 3 of these, well, line art and combos can be vector or raster, whereas halftones are always going to be raster, and I'll show you examples. Now, line art images, if they're created as vector, they're all good. There's lots of vector line art images. We get them all the time, and as long as fonts have been embedded properly and everything, we love vector. You're going to get good quality no matter what. If they're raster, if you've got line art images in raster format, it's best to use bitmap mode, which is an image that's comprised of black and white elements only. What I'm talking about here is it would have to be black and white line art only to use bitmap mode. But bitmap mode it's a mode in Photoshop that is 1-bit pixels. And there's a lot of reasons. I don't think we should spend a lot of time going into the real technical details behind this. But 1-bit pixels are either black or white. They're either on or off. There's either 0 or 1. They take 1 bit. So because it's a very unique mode, and it's definitely the mode to use when you're talking about line art images. Because of this mode, it's kind of a unique thing. With line art images in bitmap mode, we actually want to have at least 1,000 pixels per inch of resolution, or even better, 1,200 pixels per inch. Thin lines at 1,200, there is actually a slight difference. It's not a big difference, but 1,200 ppi is actually preferred if there's really thin lines. Now that seems like a lot of resolution, and well, it is, but because of the fact that it's 1-bit pixels, These files are actually quite small. Even though they have very high resolution, they're small files. And so it's definitely the way to go for good quality with black and white line art. And here's an example of a line art bitmap image. Now this could be done in vector, which would be better, but this particular one's in raster. And it looks good because it's got enough resolution. You know, the text all looks nice. It's black and white only. That's a perfect good candidate for using bitmap mode. But let me show you what happens as resolution goes down in bitmap images. We'll zoom in on that same image we just looked at, and here it is at 1,000 pixels per inch. If we downsampled that to 600 pixels per inch, you can start to see your pixels. If you look in these areas here, there's some pixels you can see on slanted lines and on curves. And if you downsample it even further to 300 pixels per inch, then you can really see your pixels when you look closely. So that's why it's very important that bitmap images have very high resolution. Okay, on to halftone images. Now, halftone images are image only, and for that reason, halftone images are always raster. You don't have any vector halftone images. They can be either grayscale or color, and I will point out, since we talked about 1-bit, that halftone images are actually 8-bit. In other words, each pixel has a lot of different possibilities. With bitmap, you've got either black or white. With grayscale or color, you've got shades of color and shades of gray. So you need 8 bits. Halftone images don't actually need to be as high resolution. 300 ppi resolution is perfectly good for halftone images, both printing and online. Here's an example of a halftone image. There's no text, there's no line art elements, it's color and image only. But something that's actually far more common is combination, or combo images we call them. Now, combos will be halftone and line art combined, or line art being line art or text. These can be both vector and raster, or raster only. The halftone part is always going to be raster, but the line art part can be vector. So we get a lot of different varieties of stuff. It depends on how the author creates the image. Again, they can be grayscale or color, and they will be 8-bit. But because there's line art elements or text elements in combos, you need more resolution, because interestingly enough, halftone only 300 dpi is perfectly fine, but when you add text and line art to the equation, you want more resolution to maintain good quality once it's in print. So we actually, 600 ppi is a good resolution. We actually would set a maximum resolution for combos, 1,000 to 1,200, which is actually kind of overkill. If you're not sure how big it's going to be, it doesn't hurt to have more resolution. The problem when you get this kind of big resolution in 8-bit files, you get really big files. And I'll come back to that in just a second. But once you've saved your file, if you've saved it at 1200 dpi, for instance, sorry, ppi, you'll want to check the size of that file. These combo images at 600 to 1200 ppi can be very, very large. And you'll want to make sure you use LTW compression, and we will definitely come back to this. So here's an example of a combo image. As you can see, this part right here, these test tubes, I think they're test tubes, I'm not sure, they're raster, so they're image only, they're halftone, whereas this is all line art with text, which makes it a combination image. Or here's a color example of a color combination. It's mostly halftone, but there is some text in here. Now this is this is raster only, and so it's important that the resolution be high for these raster elements to maintain good quality. Because if it were low resolution, this text would start to be very hard to read, or fuzzy. Okay. Moving right along, let's talk about file formats. There's a lot of different formats that you can save graphic files in. And what I've done here is I've put the name of the format, and then I've put the type of graphic that can be supported. One of the more common file formats is TIFF, which stands for Tagged Image File Format. And that is a raster format. In other words, TIFFs are always composed of pixels. Then another very standard popular format is EPS, which stands for Encapsulated PostScript. And EPS can be either vector or raster, or for that matter, it can be both at the same time. You can have an EPS that has vector parts and raster parts, all in the same EPS. It's a very it's used for a variety of different purposes. EPS is very standard. Then, of course, there's AI, which is Adobe Illustrator native format. It's very much like an EPS, but it's Illustrator's native format of EPS, and as such it can be vector or raster or both. Then we've got another raster-only format, JPEG. Everybody's heard of JPEGs, which actually stands for Joint Photographic Experts Group. It's a raster-only format, grayscale or color, and it's the most common web format. Another web format is GIF. Some people say GIF, which is Graphics Interchange Format. And this is a web-only format. You never want to use this particular format if it's ever going to go to print. And actually, GIFs are becoming less and less frequent. They're being taken over by PNG files. It's another raster only, and there are serious issues with trying to print GIFs. So my general recommendation is just don't use them. Then of course we've got PDF, popular, I should call it popular document format. It really stands for portable document format, developed by Adobe's a long time ago. Just like EPS, PDFs can be vector or raster or both. And there are some things you got to know to use PDF accurately. Not every PDF comes in many flavors, and not all of them are good for printing purposes. And then, of course, you've got Microsoft Office file formats. A lot of figures are made in Doc, in Word, or PowerPoint, or Excel. And just like the others, you can have both vector and raster elements in Microsoft Office, or a mix of both. So our recommendations are actually TIFF, AI, or EPS. We would prefer to get figures in one of these three formats. However, other formats that are perfectly good as long as they're prepared correctly are JPEG. Now, we're going to talk a little bit more about compression, but basically JPEG is a format that is compressed. That's why they're very popular on the web, because they're small files, and the reason they're small is because they're compressed. However, it is very possible to save JPEGs with too much compression and lose a lot of quality. The smaller the file, generally, the worse the quality. And we'll talk a little bit more about this. Then, of course, there's PDFs, which are, it's an excellent format, perfectly good. However, it's important to watch your distiller settings when you're saving a PDF. I'm going to come back to that in just a second. And last of all, Microsoft Office is another perfectly acceptable format for DJS. Important things you want to make sure you embed fonts. We'll come back to this, and as long as fonts are embedded properly and files are placed or inserted, images are inserted rather than linked, then it's a perfectly good format. But let me come back really quickly to PDF. Say I had, I'm actually going to make a new PowerPoint file here. No, I'm not. I'm going to make a Word file. And I'm going to go ahead and put some text on my Word file, and I'm going to insert a picture. And again, so this is one of the very important things. I'll just grab this sunset picture. I'll insert it here. So if I save this file, the important thing when saving Office is to always embed your fonts. You'll go to Tools and Save Options and embed fonts in the file. I'm going to come back to this a little bit later. So if I save this, I'm just save it on my desktop. If I want to convert it to a PDF, the best way to convert to PDF is actually to print to your Adobe PDF printer. Now you can only do this if you've got Acrobat installed, so that's the first thing. If you do the Save as PDF in Microsoft Word, I can't guarantee its quality. In fact, I can almost guarantee it won't be good quality. And even when you just do it here, saving to a PDF, you're probably going to you actually are going to lose quality unless you've made some changes, because if you go into Properties here, the default setting for Acrobat, I'm going to go into Edit to show you. This is the tricky thing about PDF that most people don't know. So I'm going to go in to edit my settings, and if I go into Images, by default, downsampling will occur, and you will also use only medium quality compression. This is all so that the file will be small enough to be transferred over the web. Unfortunately, when you're using it for images that you want to be high quality, this is a damage. This does damage to the image. So that's the standard setting. You just don't want to use it. What you'll want to do is, if you're going to make a PDF, is to make sure you go here into the properties and choose if you want to make it really easy on yourself, just choose either press quality is the one I would recommend, or you can edit. And another thing you can do, you can actually edit press quality. Give it a second. Go to Images. Forgot about this. It saves it as JPEG maximum, which is actually a pretty good compression. Maximum quality JPEG looks pretty good. But it does downsample to 300. So if you really want to make sure you're keeping all the original resolution, you'll want to turn downsampling off, both for color images and for grayscale images, depending on what's in there. Just turn it off, and then you won't downsample anything. If you're really wary of JPEG compression, you can also change it to zip compression, which is perfectly fine. Then when you save this, because I made changes, my press quality is going to stay that way. And when I say OK, I'm going to save it with those settings. But that's the danger of making a PDF with standard settings. You will downsample, and you will use a poor quality compression. Okay, back to the slideshow. And I think I was talking about how JPEG was acceptable if it's high quality compression. As long as high quality compression is used, or even better, maximum quality compression, it's good to go. With PDF, you want to make sure you choose those press settings, or even better, turn the downsampling off. And Microsoft Office is good as long as you embed fonts, and as long as you insert images rather than linking images. I'll come back to that. Okay, fonts and font embedding. One of the biggest issues we run into is fonts that have not been embedded, or strange fonts have been used. We always recommend using standard font families when labeling your images, and be consistent throughout your images. And we really only recommend these 5 fonts: Helvetica or Arial, which is a sans serif font; Times Roman, which is a serif font; Symbol is perfectly good, or for various other symbols and mathematical symbols needed, either Mathematical Pi or European Pi. As long as you stick to these 5 fonts, you probably won't have any problems at all, even if you forget to embed them. But if you go outside, it's very important to embed fonts. And let me show you why. When you're submitting your vector files, either embed fonts when possible, or convert to outlines. Converting to outlines is something I already showed you there in Illustrator. There may be other programs that can convert to outlines also, but I'm not familiar with the ways other programs do. But what the danger is this right here. If you look at this, you look at these 2 figures, they look basically the same, but if you look closely, you'll notice that the one on the left has a slightly serifed font. I think it might be Times actually. But when you get to here, you see that it says there's a little mu here, which is micrograms. Well, in this one, the font has gone bad. It's defaulted to Courier, actually, which is an old typewriter font. So it looks a little different, which at first look doesn't seem to be a problem, except when you get to the same over here, that mu has changed into an M, because that mu, the way this font was created, that mu was made from an M. So when the font went bad, it turned into a M. So it changed micrograms to milligrams, which is a serious problem. If it goes out into publication like that, definitely a problem. So that's why you need to either embed fonts or convert them to outlines. So how do you do that? If you're doing an EPS, the key thing in Illustrator creating an EPS is to check this little box that says create PDF compatible file. You might not know it, but that actually will embed the fonts. If you're saving with as native AI, there is an actual box that says embed the fonts for other applications. And what that means is it will actually store the font within the file. So if the person processing the file, in this case DJS, doesn't actually have the font, it'll be able to use the font that's in the file itself. Now, if you're doing that in a Microsoft product like PowerPoint, it's actually in the when you're as you're saving the file, and this is my PowerPoint 2003. The save options are in this little tools menu at the top right of the dialog box, and then you want to say embed your TrueType fonts, and then embed all characters is always a good idea. And as you saw, 2000 is actually different. Whoops, let me go back. Microsoft Office 2000 is actually different, and actually to show you, I will go back to Word, and when you do save as, instead of being in the top right, it's here in the bottom left, and it's save options, like I mentioned before, embed fonts in the file. Now it's a little different. Office 2007 and 2010 allow you to do a little bit more. Embed only the characters used in the document. I had actually recommend leaving that unchecked. But then there's a do not embed common system fonts. It's probably safe to leave that checked, but I would recommend turning it off, just so you embed all the fonts. So that's how you embed. Okay, let's talk about compression. Compression is a great thing because what compression does is it makes files smaller, and it's always nice to have smaller files, especially with some of these raster images that can be huge, hundreds of megabytes. What compression does is it makes them more reasonable. However, compression has a nasty side. It can definitely have quality issues, and you can see it very extremely here. This side looks nice and clean, all your edges look good, but this side, there's kind of a fuzziness that's happened, and you've got what this dirt all over, which is something we call artifacts. This is a one of the downsides of using JPEG compression. So interestingly enough, this image on the left side is compressed also. However, it's been compressed using a lossless compression. What that means is no quality has been lost. And these three types of compression are all lossless compression techniques. LZW, zip, or CCITT-G4, which is only usable in bitmap mode. But anytime you can use these compression methods, go for it. Because all it's going to do is make the file size smaller without losing any quality at all. That's why it's called lossless. However, JPEG is a lossy compression. The smaller you make the file, the more quality you're going to lose, and you get stuff like this. And I can show you another example of that, actually. Let me break out here for a minute and show you a file called Water Lilies. This is one of the system files. Now, this is a JPEG file, and the quality is not great, but it's okay. Well, if I save this file as a JPEG, and I'll actually save it to my desktop so I don't write over my examples, I get a choice here, and I get this little slider that asks me what quality level I want to do. And there's a little small file, large file. If I drag it all the way over to the right, say I'm going to save it as maximum quality, it's going to be 341K, which is actually pretty small. However, if I'm going to save it as low quality, it's only 52K, so it's a little tiny file. Well, little tiny file sounds great, but if I do that and I close it, when I reopen it, and what's really scary about this is it doesn't show you until you reopen it. When I reopen this really low quality and I zoom in, look what I've done to the quality. It's made these little squares. Now you'll see this when you save to really low quality JPEG. And so obviously that's not good. So never ever use low quality JPEG compression if you want your image to look good. However, on the other hand, maximum quality JPEG compression actually looks pretty good. So let me go back to my slide here. I pointed out that you've got some lossless techniques, LZW, ZIP, CCIT, G4, but if you try those and they're still just way too big, it's okay to use JPEG compression as long as it's maximum. Your maximum are very high, and then you can get a smaller file. You're always safe with these, though. And I'll point out also, when you're saving a TIFF, it's really a no-brainer. Always save TIFF with at least LZW. This is a totally lossless technique. Use it. But you can actually save TIFF. This is something that happened, it hasn't been around forever, but it's been around for a while now, I guess. You can save TIFFs with JPEG compression also, which is a little bit scary to me. I'd rather TIFFs, if you wanted to save with JPEG compression, make it a JPEG. But you can save TIFFs with JPEG compression, and here's your slider again. Okay, there's some basic foundations of digital artwork. Moving on to color.